Hey everyone, this is Craig from Asset Horizon, and I just want to say thank you for being patient with us the past week or so. We've all been on the road and on the move, and what you're about to hear actually is our live show from Pete's Candy Store in Brooklyn, New York on May 30th. That was about maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago now. We have some very cool guests confirmed already for this summer, including Greg Sadler, who's been on the show, Claire Colebrook, a great Deleuze scholar, and also Stuart Kendall will return to talk about Antonin Artaud in July. Now is the perfect time to support us at the $5 level, especially if you want to join our Pierre Klasovsky reading group, where we will read Nietzsche in the Vicious Circle starting in August of this year. We just started a new reading group, that's Foucault's The Order of Things, hosted by Will, so you want to pop in for that. Just navigate to the links in the description and find our Patreon account and subscribe at the $5 level, and you can take advantage of every reading group. Support Asset Horizon. Okay, let's take a listen to our most recent live event where we talked about our book, Anti-Oculus, A Philosophy of Escape, and we engaged with our listeners. Yeah.
Thank you.
We're going to break into this like, you know when you watch a movie and it just cuts you right into the middle of the scene? That's how I'm going to do this. Why are you covering your faces? On May 16th, 2024, British MP Suella Braverman, alongside a GB News journalist, descended upon an encampment of pro-Palestinian protesters at Cambridge University under the pretense of surveying the views of students occupying the campus. Her expressed intent was to amplify voices angled against the host of unspeakable horrors that have been visited upon the people of Gaza and other Palestinians residing under the Israeli occupation. Though Braverman putatively arrived to help supporters to get their message out, she and her entourage were immediately met with a wall of cold reticence. Braverman's initial upbeat query quickly spun into a slew of patronizing quips and prods when she realized her spectacle was dead on arrival. Why are you covering your faces? Students rebuffed her obvious attempt to recode their act of resistance, to ultimately humiliate them, and then later filter their sentiments through the fascist imaginary propagated by mainstream media. Despite her ploy, the silence enacted by Cambridge protesters occasioned a necessary lapse, a suspension of discourse, one which preempted Braverman's plan to embarrass efforts opposing the ongoing genocide of Palestinians. Now, amidst the self-ruination of Israel's shambling propaganda effort, the nation and its allies have been locked in a desperate scramble to capture and manipulate flows of semio-capital. They have resorted to tweaking algorithms on social media sites, exploiting vulnerabilities in messaging apps like WhatsApp to locate targets, and outright legislating a ban on a popular platform where the message of resistance thrives most. It's no secret that ruling class actors prey upon the accelerated desire for connection fostered by our collective engagement in online spaces. Our compulsion to speak works in conjunction with traditional forms of censorship in a kind of double movement. We have all been well trained to produce utterances whose surpluses are mediated, curated, cut up, recast, or redeployed to serve a hegemonic narrative. This tactic is not only exploited by Braverman and her ilk, but also by a freshman class of dubious opportunists active in online political milieus. Upon being sniffed out by our friends and comrades at recent protests, a few of these quote-unquote wreckers, as they are aptly called, inevitably expose their raw biases and base convictions, candidly venting their frustrations on their own online platforms. On one end, apparatuses function forcefully to suppress a radical imaginary, or they propagate a sense of terror, fostering a reluctance to speak. At the other end, apparatuses seek to antagonize vacuoles of non-communication, or they attempt to infiltrate the sacred conspiracies essential to nurturing forms of life flourishing outside its mechanism of capture. Here we must go astray and rush to that liminality which in Anti-Oculus we have called the imageless image, the threshold of the new, where grids of intelligibility are dissipated and political ontologies are subverted. It is also here that our work perhaps finds its most important resonance in the face of the current atrocities we see now. How do we burn our way out of the cyberpunk present? And just to borrow a few familiar terms from our friend Federico Campagna, how do we evacuate the all-encompassing horrors of Technic, which has grown conterminously with capitalism? How do we overcome the totalizing inscription of empire's absolute language? The stakes are very high. It's life or death. By now, we have all borne witness to images of dismemberment and snapshots of massacres in Gaza that rival the most gruesome of horror films. Here within the imperial core, the ruling class continues unprecedented campaigns of repression to staunch even the most modest of campus protests. The apocalypse is here, but as they say, it's unevenly distributed. That said, inasmuch as Anti-Oculus presents itself as a sophisticated conceptual array, it will have all been a futile undertaking if we cannot make use of it tactically to address the intersection of lives devastated abroad and the homebound fascism we now confront. Braverman's question of why are you covering your faces is first and foremost a question about shame, to which we should reply, why aren't you covering your face? As Deleuze has written in a series of perennial essays about the plight of Palestinians, the West continues to indulge heinous acts of brutality to satisfy its implacable demand for power, a kind of power ultimately incapable of putting its own shame under erasure. But, of course, it is less a question of covering the face than dismantling it. It is only by subverting faciality and ocularity in the broadest sense that we can escape these horrors and create the new, an operation which together we have striven to articulate in our book, though our efforts have been far from exhaustive. Acid Horizon, as a podcast, as a study group, and as an assemblage, persists in its endeavor to create concepts hostile to the order of things. We hope that tonight we not only offer a presentation of Anti-Oculus, a philosophy of escape, but we also want to encourage thinking through and beyond our work, the work that we have put forward together here with the people tonight. And given that the book has been out for more than a few months, we're hoping that you have robust questions and a response to anything that you've read in the book. And just as a brief aside, my opening comments on communication and semiocapital and so forth has been motivated by the work here of Adam C. Jones, who will have his own solo album come out in the fall. Solo album meaning a new book entitled The New Flesh. And what was the subtitle?
Life and Death in the Data Economy. It's a book about how posting drives you mad, but also feeds various algorithms that also will destroy us all, mostly in terms of so-called artificial intelligence, which doesn't exist, and its use in imperialist forms of mapping and weaponry.
I hope that we preview a little bit of that here tonight. But before we begin, very seriously, it's a must that we deliver our utmost gratitude to all of you here tonight. And perhaps we can later interrogate the great mystery over some beer and pizza of how all of you managed to stick with us these past 4 years. And with that said, simply thank you and welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory Podcast. And so with that said here tonight, we do want to talk about Anti-Oculus, and we'll kind of do the spiel that maybe you saw online in London. That's where you're from. Yeah, and Houseman's in London. So we'll probably, do a little bit of difference and repetition in that regard. But I'm going to turn the mic over now to Adam, who was basically the brain that is responsible for the inception of the project of Anti-Oculus. And he's just going to talk about sort of the general contours of the book, and we'll go from there. So take it away, Adam C. Jones.
I'm too self-deprecating in English for that, and indeed, fuck the English. But, I'm stuck with it by the grace of God. So the book really was first commissioned to do it by Repeater as a kind of a summary of various things we've done so far, because, the setup of the podcast is we just read a piece and we explain it back to ourselves, and we learn from it collectively, and we hopefully to give some of that out to yourselves, to the audience, and even quite literally to ourselves again. I mean, doing The New Flesh as the follow-up book, I literally I lost my notes for Baudrillard listened to our episode on Baudrillard, and was therefore listening to a copy of a copy in quite a fitting move if you're into that sort of Baudrillardian hyper-reality kind of thing. But the main point of the book was, so during the lockdowns, I did go a little bit mad because British people are snitches, just generally so. I mean, at one point, the police had to call up and say, can you stop reporting people for taking like 2 minutes longer than the average walk? And it was interesting. At the time I was getting into cybernetics, I was thinking about control theory, mostly through like our readings of Gilles Deleuze and some of these cybernetics textbooks I've been studying. Mostly they're management textbooks. Most times cybernetics appears contemporaneously as management studies. And if you go to, for example, a lot of business studies departments in the United Kingdom, they are loaded with cybernetic Marxists because they teach organizational theory. And it was the only place they could teach Marx without being sort of thrown out on their asses as dirty communist infiltrators. Until now, which, the fascist UK government has kind of seen a bit through it. But yes, the sort of madness was, it was an interesting thing for me because it was one of the first global events which posed so many philosophical problems, but one of them was the problems of policing. And so in the UK, there was a great debate over what is essential. These essential workers, essential aisles. I mean, the question of essentialism became immanent to everyday life. And I think it must have been similar here. I mean, most notoriously, for example, obviously essential workers, who has to stay, it's people who deliver takeaway, people who like do Uber Eats, are they essential? It's a question of what is necessary for the reproduction of society. Social reproduction came first and foremost. How to reproduce things as they are at the bare minimum. And then there were also events, for example, in the UK, for example, they were shutting down non-essential aisles in supermarkets. And you think, okay, what counts as that? They shut down so-called ethnic food aisles because, that's not essential. That's just the main foodstuffs of most of the people who live here. Great. Or toys, because, you don't need to entertain children when you're sort of locked in for a few months. The question of essence and the question of policing and the general paranoia of the general public and paranoia about that paranoia very much fed into the third chapter of this, which is the ocularity chapter, which is about essentially being captured within forms of recognition that delimit you in advance and allow for sort of policing techniques to be applied to you. And that was sort of the moment of madness, sort of stretched out into a wider study of not only paranoia, but trying to break through politics. Paranoia is quite problematic politically. So what I mean by that is often paranoia ends up being someone is after me. This isn't a personal, but it talks about control, but as sort of good Deleuzians, we can't talk about controllers. These are more about general patterns of management, habits of governance that gradually accumulate throughout the years and how they're impacting the date in the history of policing. And we're not just talking about police when we talk about policing. We're also talking about epistemological ways of maintaining borders. And if, to use the cliche, and it's true, every border implies the violence of its maintenance. And we want to think about the borders of categories. So, for example, in the first chapter, it's mostly setting the scene of the cyberpunk present, taking a sort of an impulse from people like the CCRU and, to use a very bitch phrase, that fucking idiot Nick Land. I realise I can't say the C word's not as normalised here, but, fill that in for Nick Land. Take it in the Australian and British sense, not the American sense, please. And we want to develop that impulse, look at control systems. The first of which we want to look at is directly policing, which was the chapter on Burn Your Way Out, which teaches the elementary concepts of cybernetics, thermostats, feed forward, feedback, how systems learn from sort of error and how they try to preempt error and how their attempts to preempt error themselves learn through the history of their attempts to preempt them. And that was essentially an introduction to cybernetics and how to fight cops. Because the cybernetics of policing are very much built into this book. The tactics, for example, of kettling are very much based on cybernetic principles. You basically try and either let people cool off and sort of provide a negative feedback to their general motion throughout the streets, or you're trying to accelerate this in positive feedback and make them essentially panic and cause a controlled explosion, which you can then arrest people from. We want to show sort of the limits of these forms of policing. Because there are limits and they can be beaten and they're only as good as their own history. And the history has been very much upset. And that's why we want to go into the ocularity chapter by applying this kind of control analysis to various kinds of control in terms of borders of categories of how we're recognized. That is, the history of sex and gender, not to keep them too distinct, they're both recognitive categories. History of racialization and the ways that people have subverted it. For example, racialization based in biological racism, as well as what's called theological naturalism, which is like projecting natural qualities onto religious backgrounds. Looking at that history, looking at how these systems learn and how they fail. Particularly looking at it from everything from the Haitian Revolution to the head of the NAACP, a guy called Walter White, who basically looked like me. But given the highly zooming in development of scientific racism in the United States, one drop rule, racialized as black. He was able to report on things, get the message out, and basically subvert going under the category presented to him. So that's generally a sense in which my contributions gave a sort of control semblance to the book. I've probably gone on too long, haven't I? We should probably move on to the post-cybernetic stuff, because that's just the cybernetics. There's more than that.
Well, maybe just a brief interlude. I just want you to get a sense of, all right, first of all, I'm about 20 years older than these guys, right? Let's just start there. And so during the pandemic, I mean, it was just incredible to meet with a diverse set of voices who are kind of more or less in the same ballpark in terms of philosophical interests and research interests. I was able to discover for myself as not necessarily a late comer to philosophy or anything like that, but kind of a perennial returner and somebody who's had a lifelong interest in this work, but and has done like party politics and things like that in the past, but never found a way to engage as uniquely with the kind of work that we're doing. And I'll just say, podcasts get a bad rap online.
Rightfully so.
Right? Well, yes. Okay. It depends. Depends on the podcast. But at the same time...
We're the good one. We're so different.
That's right. But I will say, from the inside looking outward, it's a truly edifying experience to locate real friends and comrades and people that you can work with, read with, and discover with. And often what you see in terms of online discourse and the kind of like, low-grade outrage towards podcasts that you see is like, once you've experienced it from the inside, it's so different. But
you're the real victims, yeah.
Well, with that said, I have more to say about that, but I'm going to pass it to Will. Will's somebody who's really, given me a new perspective on the way that we look at the work of Foucault, for example, and also thinking through the lens of disability has been very enlightening for somebody who isn't disabled and has really shaped my views. And just another upshot to engaging with the kind of community that we had. And so with that said, I'll have Will say a few comments about his work. It looks like he was writing a book while we were talking. He wrote a lot of shit down. I don't know what was written down, but we're about to find out.
Well, thanks everyone for coming. And I have to say that my contributions to the book are frankly the result of reading Adam's work. I had spent a lot of time sort of holed up in an apartment in Pittsburgh, and frankly, when the counterinsurgency of the eye was written, the first thing that I did was release and record my own reading of it, which perhaps is a bit self-aggrandizing. But I found...
No, hold on. That's an act of love. To take somebody else's work and read it out loud and commit it to recording. But anyway.
But yeah, there was something about the way in which he approached the question of error, and the way in which error is precisely that through which we come to understand subjectivity as that which is individuated. Right? So Foucault is a thinker of difference, but it's not helpful to posit him in that vein. Right? He's a thinker of the epistemic grids that posit the necessary elements for these divisions. So when Foucault was writing in homage to Canguilhem, a really important philosopher of science, he wrote that perhaps life is only ever understood as that which can err. And I think that this question of erring, of errancy, is precisely the question of the political as it exists in the parliamentary. But beyond that, I think that when we write sort of about surveillance, when we write about the covering of faces, when we're concerned about the relationship between a political ontology and the various power relations it produces, we have to understand that we're talking about a field of identified zones of difference and of capacities. So the reality here for me was that if we were going to write a book that deals with the philosophy of escape, I felt like there couldn't be a better place to start than the relationship between 19th century psychiatry, the physiocrats, and frankly, the work around discipline and punish. Because it's not just a question of resistance, right? We think in terms of resistance, we think first puissance, right? The application of power, the application of violence, and then the retort, right? Resistance gets framed as rather reactive, especially, by certain thinkers who are still caught up in the French Maoist tradition. And what Foucault sort of allows us to see is that, in fact, there's a gesture between human flourishing and the production of resistance. It is modes of existence that become resistant precisely because they momentarily escape a particular epistemic grid. But then what we find is that it is precisely these individuals, and they take many faces throughout history, who end up being the vanguard of new systems of control. Take, for example, a French thinker of disability, one of the first, really, to isolate disability as a space of intellectual discussion and of the application of pedagogical practice, Edouard Segon. And his approach to disability ends up necessitating accounting for disability as a question of social defense. And what we need to do is to distinguish between those who can be redeemed, and these are his words, and those who are doomed to a sense of personal infallibility, which he puts on the side of the imbecilic. So for me, when we were talking about a philosophy of escape, I felt that it was necessary to understand, if we were to be hostile to the contemporary order of things, if that was to be our primary approach, we really had to dwell in the basic foundations of our contemporary polis. Hostis, to be hostile, is to not necessarily be external to a particular form of politics, right? Catiline, when accused by Cicero of being a hostile agent, of being hostis, is dwelling within the walls of the city of Rome. So I wanted to sort of situate myself as a disabled philosopher of disability, and try to understand politics through capacity, through ability. And what I've sort of come to determine, at least in our epoch, is what psychiatry functions to do, what the politics of disability functions to do, is it really produces a space where political animals can become subject to typology. Where, for example, a man can engage in self-immolation in opposition to the genocide in Gaza and is immediately refuted as insane. Where anarchists operating in the 19th century can be analyzed by Cesare, Lombroso, as being deficient, right? As having facial deficiencies. And what we find for the justification of the political partitioning of the present is that there is an insufficiency in the human being that is attesting to that politics, either by trying to escape it in the sense of 19th century anarchists in 1841, where Lombroso says, unlike Charlotte Corday and Karl Marx, who had wonderful physiques, these anarchists were in fact rather disgusting and had sort of visible facial deformities. And I think what the conclusion that I came to through reading Adam, and sort of the problem that I would then pass on to Craig, is if the relationship between abnormality and anarchy is the relationship between anarchy and abnormality, and the fact that they both sort of dwell in this zone, what needs to happen to the way in which we imagine the political space, the striated political space, in order to produce this? And then how do we even conceive of politics as a practice, as an attempt of egress, as an art that doesn't, once again, find itself in the representational game of social defense? And that's sort of where I kind of left the problem for Craig.
Yeah.
And so you can imagine being a man 20 years their senior and not having had written anything down by the point these guys were finished with their material, which is actually not completely true. It was actually a real gift for me to be confronted with these two pieces of work and be forced to think in terms of thinkers that I consider dominant mediators. And what I wanted to do with the book was kind of a celebration or an homage to some of my favorite thinkers, being Deleuze, James Hillman, Nietzsche, and so forth. And the question was, given the sort of dual pressure from both of their contributions, how could I use concepts within their work, not as a hermeneutics of innocence, not necessarily to vindicate any one of these thinkers or all of these thinkers in any sense, but as an act of kind of a joyous sabotage of their work and, breaking it apart and using that bricolage to respond to it, and also doing something quite different than what they had done. I mean, being perhaps, I don't know, Will might argue with this, maybe being the left Nietzschean of the group, I left it to myself to think, how can I create a sort of positive concept, a sort of practical aspect of the book, but also I wanted to think about how I could ground this work epistemologically, because that seemed to be something that was not necessarily left out, but it wasn't articulated in the kind of fullness which I think the book had demanded. So the work of the imageless image that we see in the last chapter is not only a work of articulating the kind of epistemology or anti-epistemology or anti-ontology that I think the book is striving for the whole way through, but I wanted to find a way to create a call to arms, hence the invocation of a kind of sacred conspiracy at the end. And one of the figures that really stood out to me in our group discussions and in the books that get passed around some of you are on Discord and like book recommendations are just going around, essays and so forth, was the figure of Marguerite Porete. Porete, to me, really reintroduced the idea of mysticism to me as a political act. And this is somebody, if you listen to one of our recent episodes with Federico Campagna, he picks up the concept of mysticism as that which is antagonistic to the epistemologies of technic and technology. And I thought that was just a great overlap between our work. And what I appreciate about the example of Marguerite Porete that heads off the chapter of the imageless image is you have a figure who is a woman and is a Beguine nun. Did I pronounce that right? Beguine nun, who is basically the receiver of a divine message from which she then derives her own manuscript, which of course challenges the dominant theology of the time. What I found very profound about that is that in her example, when she was ultimately convicted and then burned at the stake, her execution was carried out in a way where all of the onlookers were able to see her, and her body was burned with complete equanimity. She did not react, she did not respond, she just burned in silence. And to me, that image, I thought, was an apt image, to sort of frame what could be the contours of a quote unquote positive political program for this, even though we don't really get that out of the book, but as a way to at least think about how we might envision a world or a politics beyond the repressive structures of technic, beyond grids of intelligibility and so forth. And so with that, tying those strands together was it was a sort of philosophical milestone for myself insofar as I was able to, I think, in a sort of creative Tetris-y kind of way, integrate these various concepts to come up with a concept that I think actually works quite well to involute and unsettle this impulse in the Western tradition towards ontology. And it raises question about the nature of silence, the nature of social withdrawal, the nature of resistance. And in the act of writing, I'm writing myself into that script. And it seems like my comments are sort of meta comments on the writing of the book. But what was profound and important to me is in articulating that, we are inscribing ourselves with these words and ideas and transforming ourselves. And I think ultimately what Anti-Oculus did, if nothing else, was for us and for readers of the book to experience our transformation and maybe even feel the pressure, the impulse to be transformed by it as well. Now, with that said, I would like to open up the floor to comments, questions. And here's the thing, you don't have to ask about the book. Maybe you've read the book, maybe you have questions about it, comments. Maybe we said something in an episode that absolutely pissed you off. Now's the time to address that. But before I do that, let's also introduce Noah here. Noah, can you stand up? So Noah is the secret fourth, who was the guy in the Beatles? Billy Preston, right? He's like the Billy Preston figure in the Beatles. So he's playing keyboard. Was it?
There were 4 Beatles.
No, but Billy Preston came in and played keyboard and stuff. So, but Noah has been instrumental in helping organize our reading groups and doing some artwork and so forth for us. And Noah, if you wouldn't mind, I would like to employ you with no wages to carry this mic to anybody who has a question. Yeah, so you see how that goes.
You also did all the artwork in the book, and it's fucking sick.
Yeah, and Noah did the artwork in the book, so let's give him a round of applause for that.
Thank you. And that was a fun process working with these guys on, what exactly they wanted their ideas or chapters to be represented by, and it was an honor to do that. So yeah. All right. Any questions?
Oh, wait, before we go, I just want to let you know, we have about, 10, maybe 8 or 9, 10 books back here, and I have maybe 6 tarot decks. I just want to walk away with $40 to recoup the charges for the book. So if you don't have the book and you want to buy it, we'll say it's on a sliding scale, anywhere between $10 and $15. Just give it. Maybe you can pay it forward. Give me 20 and we'll just give one to somebody else. The tarot decks, I have to do a tarot event on Sunday, so we'll talk about that. But if you really want a tarot deck, we'll say $20. I don't know. We'll negotiate. I'm really easy. So, well, with that said, let's get to the Q&A aspect of our show. And
I have a taker already.
Okay, great.
Hello, I'd like to first thank you all for arranging this encounter that we are all here enjoying, and also for writing the book. I read it a while back, right after it was published, and I took a bunch of notes. And I was thinking at the time, what a great resource it is, and how powerful it would be if everyone really understood the descriptions that you had articulated regarding the ways that power influences, manipulates, organizes, segregates, controls us. And I wanted to ask all of you right now whether you think the awareness of all of these modes of control by itself would be sufficient for all of us in this room, but all of us generally speaking, to subvert and escape these controls. Would awareness do the job?
I don't think so. I mean, I'm still as controlled as anyone else. It's knowing points of short circuiting, of course, always comes with opportunity. there are opportunities to subvert things. I mean, there are been, for example, kettling. You need like a communicative infrastructure and a bit of luck to outrun the police. I mean, even, for example, during 2011 and particularly the students, so there were protests in the UK about there was tripling the fees for tuition to £9,000 a year. And there was a service, I can't remember what it was called, you call them up and they would tell you where the police were and they would tell you what directions to take to avoid the fuckers. You can encircle the police, you can kettle them, but you need a bit of luck, you need organisation, bad, I guess word there. Organisation, and you need to sort of have, you need to have information, which luckily we're drowning in the shit now. But awareness, there are ways of individually subverting it, yeah, but there are opportunities there. I mean, it depends. It's what we talk about. So the concept of creative involution, which I didn't understand until we got to the conclusion of the book, which was essentially withdrawing inside in order to make space for an attack. I was thinking about this in terms of the concept of marronage, as fugitive slaves, the preparations for the Haitian Revolution. You just need opportunities. I mean, one of the examples I give of inner subversions and a bit of luck, one of the examples I give is of anti-colonial resistance in the Belgian Congo. So you could speak only certain languages if you was a colonized subject in the Congo. But those languages were any ones recognized by the state of Belgium, which included Dutch. Did any of the Belgian occupiers speak Dutch? No. Could you speak Dutch openly and get away with it? Yes. Can you organize under that rubric? Yes. Can you kill the fuckers and eventually kick them out? Yes. Awareness is, it gives you sense to recognize opportunities under the surface. The philosophy of escape is not itself escape. If philosophy was suitable to do all the stuff we wanted to do, we would have done it by now. It's mostly just giving out theoretical toolkits, as Mark said, like theoretical weapons, and it's not exhaustive. It's there to be generative in a way.
Maybe just one quick thing that I'll say about that is that, I mean, at least in writing the book, maybe to offer a very small but perhaps ineffective counter to Adam, is that I do think it slightly moves the needle in terms of not only developing our awareness, but I think there's imperceptible ways in which we deploy these tactics, even in conversations and the way that we organize. Like, how the hell did I get 50 people to be in this room right now? Like, that just doesn't happen by magic either. But at the same time, too, it made me think of, while Adam was talking, the idea of the narcissism of small differences. Often this is applied to notions of theoretical differences, but we should also think of that term in terms of the differences with which our daily situations unfold. There are ways in which we are not unlike each other. We're very much like each other in so many ways, in terms of the precariousness of labor. Some of us, might be a paycheck or two away from a complete disaster, that sort of thing, health crises. And I think sometimes, or I think quite often rather, it's important to consider, even with somebody with a divergent viewpoint from you, on the left, is how close they are to you in terms of their vulnerability and their capacity to be exploited. And that's something that we always have to keep in mind. I think one of the dangers of just being ensconced in this discourse all the time is just being completely differentiated within that discourse, but realizing that we aren't very differentiated in terms of our precarity and vulnerability.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I'm going to just oppose Adam.
It happens all the time.
Knowing it's half the battle.
Yeah, and the thing here is this question of awareness, I think, needs to be reframed. It's a question of accepting the intolerable as tolerable, or tolerating the intolerable. And in this sense, it's a very anti-Marxist position, right? That for example, we did the theses on Feuerbach recently, and we all kind of disagreed at the end. But for me, to interpret the world is to fundamentally change it, to accept a grid of intelligibility on its own terms, and then say, this is how I will fight it. Well, that's precisely how the proletariat has failed. And so this idea that we subjectivate workers, as possessors of labor power, and then deploy, this is taking up the epistemic grid of capital, or even worse, just taking up their metaphysical assumptions, and then thinking, then if we simply just accept the subject functions that are handed to us, and then by multiplying our forces, we'll be able to overturn. This is a ridiculous notion today. I mean, especially as dissipated we are as subjects. I mean, we're not dealing with coherent, totalized bourgeois subjects. This is not the world in which, it's like what Adorno says, right? Philosophy had its opportunity to realize itself in Marxism. Oh my God, we still have philosophy. What happened, right? And this idea that, in fact, what we have to do is perpetually prioritize activity. I hope I don't sound like Adorno, although I do kind of sound like Adorno in that one essay on resignation. This idea that it is only through physical change. You have to ask yourself what this change would mean. And this idea that, in fact, we're handing tools, for me, still sort of reeks of a kind of strange vanguardism for, like, we're a podcast. These tools have been abandoned. And in that sense, one never finishes a book, one just like wipes their hands of it. This book's not done. And there are conceptual holes throughout at least my chapter. Just mine, by the way.
I know all the problems with my chapter, and I'm just waiting for somebody's.
Do I think it's sufficient? No, but I want to question this notion of sufficiency. What is the threshold now of changing the world? And I think that this question remains an open one.
I'll just say one quick thing before we go to another question. And I think this will sort of like encapsulate, I think, the importance of certain figures in the podcast. I really don't think we have fulfilled the accelerationist promise through desubjectivation in the way that Deleuze understands nomad subjectivity. I really don't. And I think that's one of the reasons I stay so committed to his work. And I think Foucault is very much in the same vein, when we talk about destituting the subject function.
Hi, thanks for this talk. This was great. I've been a fan of the podcast for a long time now. So I'm currently a PhD student at Columbia, and so the past few months, for the past whole year, has been sort of a strange mix of both feeling like the university, not Columbia, but the university as an institution, is a very powerful body, in fact, for creating like sort of spaces of resistance. But then also the sort of constant reminder that the university is also this like corporate body that can't be disentangled from the student body. And so I've been wondering about just the university as this kind of deeply scholastic inheritance and these ideas about kind of resistance and ocularity. And I just wanted to sort of get your opinion on, is the university, both as an institution or as an ideal or a kind of social body, is that a failed project, or like is the university something that can persist in a kind of future that you might imagine?
Here's our current PhD student, Will.
Yeah, I'm a PhD student at Stony Brook, so not too far away. I love Bernard Harcourt, although he's not in the philosophy department. But he's been an absolutely essential resource for us and also for students in the past few weeks, especially. So, much love to Bernard. When you talk about a space for fomenting political resistance, in this sense, one has to just look at large-scale industry for Marx, right? It's precisely the fact that there are actually bodies in a shared space engaging in some sort of collective endeavor from which they're necessarily alienated and yet together. But when we say, can the university be rescued? And I think it's important that you singled out its scholastic foundation. So let's think about the frontispiece of Leviathan. There are two sections on the frontispiece of Leviathan. On one side, you have the weapons of war. On the other, you have the monastic scholastic process. And where the cannons are firing at the bottom, on the other side, one is defending essentially what we would call a dissertation today. So Hobbes, for example, is very aware of the dangers that persisted in particular theologies, in particular theology. This idea of within and against is something that I think has its absolute limit at the reality that one remains dependent on an institution that is fundamental to the reproduction of a particular kind of upper middle class in the United States. And I think that one of the benefits of being a student is wrecking that process, ruining as many minds as possible. And I think that rather than, speaking of the undercommons or talking about stealing erasers or anything like that, right, which is all very valuable, steal from your university, they steal from you all the time. What we have a sort of unique opportunity to do is to engage with one another that we won't have again. And it's here where I actually agree with someone who I don't find compelling, Noam Chomsky, where he says that the only responsibility of the student is to take seriously the fact that they're a student. I think that's right, in as much as we always are working to abandon the predicates that come with student in this epoch. The only thing that matters to the student is the fact that they're imminent to a discussion about how the world and we are as human beings are interpreted. And I think that it's in that capacity that we actually can start to imagine alternatives. Be as critical as possible of the very hyper-capitalist cohort that you have, or participate in activities, right? I just want to speak momentarily about Stony Brook. President McGuinness tore down an encampment less than one day after it was built. There were no stakes in the ground. The tents were mostly symbolic. The students were occupying the space sort of in a kind of, just in the sense that these undergraduate students, who are, I think, remarkable, wanted to participate and show solidarity. But McGuinness found this unacceptable and immediately, brutally had Suffolk County Police come in and tear the whole thing down. Students were transferred 30 minutes away with no way back at 2:00 in the morning. This was an act not just of discipline, but of outright cruelty. These students had their cell phones removed from them and given to a private security company. Right? So there's a massive uproar in the Northeast about this. Faculty is assuming that this is going to mean the absolute worst. And I think yesterday I received an email saying she's headed to Yale to be president of Yale. So what I say is to all of those who are at Yale, they owe it to the students who were brutalized at Stony Brook to show her that she won't escape what it is to be a student, right? She can, the reality is, for me, that being a student has nothing to do with the conventions of what we call education, but it has to do with the fact of experiencing one another through what Craig would call an adventure in thought, but something that I think is more helpful, just an encounter. It's a space of encounters, like any other. And I think that for that reason, there will always be a place for it. Whether it takes the scholastic form, I don't know. It doesn't exist in this form currently. Most schools are degree farms. Harvard's graduating class had an average of 4.0 or 397. Right? These are not serious institutions. These are institutions that have power but no legitimacy. And that's not me reactively saying, oh, I would like to return to a place where we have both power and legitimacy. But the thing that is horrifying is that we know precisely what we see is intolerable, and yet we choose to tolerate it. And this isn't the Zizekian thing, right, where he says, oh, forgive them for they know exactly what they do. No, The problem is they tolerate it because they don't know. Because they don't, we don't know that we participate in it. And it's precisely through this awareness, to bring this back, that moment where one can separate oneself from one's participation. Just for an instance, is I think if one person did that, if one person hesitated in an interaction that's predicated on either the capitalist mode of production, ableist modernity, if one person reflected on it for one instant, for me, that's enough for this book. So I hope that that's kind of getting at what you're talking about. But I agree, I have the same anxieties. Like, what exactly am I going to be doing in 5 years? What's the fucking point of my dissertation? So I think mobilizing that precarity and understanding that, no, you're detested, you're a problem, they would love to get rid of you, is something that I think you need to harness and enjoy. And find professors who enjoy it with you, because I think that's the way in which the university still can function as a zone of resistance.
Just real quick, who are teachers here? Anybody? Is anyone a teacher right now? No, grad students? Oh, a lot, yeah, of course. Was anyone a teacher in the past? The reason I'm asking is because I've worked in so many different teaching scenarios, and I'll just be real quick about this, is that I've worked I was essentially a full professor through the extended university, but the one privilege they would not grant me was the title of professor. I made the money and I had the benefits and everything else besides, but if you ever end up working through the extended university, what you're getting is essentially a picture 10 to 15 years down the pike of whatever it is that we're living with under now, if it still is neoliberalism, that those horrors will be visited on the job market of the traditional university. I mean, we had basically a CEO who would just come in once a year or once a semester and go to the director of the program that I worked for and ask, how many? And he just wanted to know a number of students who were there, and he'd walk away. I mean, that's how invested he was. And I attempted as a teacher then to sort of migrate or take a line of flight to a more noble institution. So I went to the LA County Prison, which all of these experiences are exceptionally rewarding. And, like Will was saying, it's in the context of a place like when I taught in an intensive English language program that brought people from around the world, most of whom were mostly either middle class or very wealthy students. In some cases, they had students who were on scholarships. But to have that convergence of young people in a place to learn something and do something like that is very special. And to be able to go into an in-custody carceral environment and give somebody education or just the sort of minimum of recognition that they need to get a leg up, just to understand that they still exist within the world, that's very important. That's very important for them. However, within that position, I was asked to fulfill police functions and sometimes in a very subversive and an uncomfortable way for myself. And that was something that ultimately I knew that I would have to get away from. And that said, my refrain for tonight is start a podcast, get together with people. No, but seriously, I think what we do within this group, like to use a word that we're all quite familiar with here, nomadic. I mean, we can research whatever we want. We follow our interests. Every reading group and every interaction that we have within the context of what we do is intensely rewarding. Adam, do you have anything to say? What's going on in Britain?
They're shutting down my department, dude. Let's go with something else.
Well, no. Say a little bit about that, because I do believe that's important.
We don't make enough money for elite reproduction, and so it's just Oxford and Cambridge, really. That's kind of it. It's reproducing, because we didn't kill our aristocrats like the French in most of Europe. And we should probably get to that actually, but we didn't. And so it's basically just Oxford and Cambridge. The rest of universities are just landlords. And they have some surpluses, which means they, do degrees and that. The British university system has already decapitated itself. It's just a matter of time because British universities rely on students from outside the country, and yet we're run by a bunch of racists, be they in the red team, Labour, or the blue team, Tories. It's easy to get them confused. And they've destroyed that source after being racist, really. So they've already set themselves what's coming to them, and. fuck them. That's just it, really.
And look, we're looking around at various syllabi and, programs online. There's people using our stuff, podcasts that we've created online. The state is parasitic on the war machine of the podcast world, which we're talking about here tonight. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, thank you for having a great podcast. Well, I kind of want to come back to pandemic, and I apologize ahead of time because I know it was a traumatic experience for many people. But what was interesting about pandemic was that, yes, like in England, it was so much more stricter than here in New York. Or if you go to Florida, it wasn't at all, right? Or if you go to Costa Rica, nothing was happening there. So I think that's a great example of, I don't know, did they see something in people that they didn't, or was it just political clearly? Or was there certain resistance within people already that they were like, well, we can't really push it here. We can push it on these people. Like, I'm from Slovakia, so Slovakia had it like England, very strict, and you couldn't buy toys, which was ridiculous. I got a dog during pandemic, so I can go for a walk. So I wonder, right? Like, can we approach it from that perspective?
So is the question, did they? Yeah, Adam, go ahead. Adam's chomping at the bit.
So the question is like, is there something visible within us that we can show up as regular people? It's kind of like what Will was saying, it's awareness, but also like, how do we show awareness so that when people will try to do something to us, it will be like, you know what, these are tough people,
I think that a lot of this motivated actually the second chapter. The question motivating the second chapter is, how many of us have to die before we start killing them in response? Because it's true. I mean, the UK government at the time, led by Boris Johnson and his advisors, were talking about acceptable levels of death. Which parts of the social body can we cut off, as in condemn to death? This is the steam let off in the kettle so it doesn't explode. But where do we set that threshold before people start realizing that, it's like the movie A Bug's Life, when they realize that we outnumber them and the citizen turns into the insurgent. It was all about finding that limit case. And I think being aware of the fact that there is a constantly socially acceptable level of death, that little excess you can cut off the top. I mean, this is the treaty of the Imperial Corps of its workers. It's a treaty. It's a treaty for treats. We get the treats. I mean, if the beer stopped flowing in London, we would have got rid of the king by now, to be honest. He's going to get rid of himself soon, but he hasn't got long. He's not even going to make it onto the money. But this constant meta-stability, sort of the violence of everyday life, is really something which is hard to be aware of. And it's not just this individualized sense of like, we are all so complicit, because we are, but we don't need to moralize it in the same sense of it's not just about us, because we can't change it on our own. We can't take on the responsibility all our own. It's got to be diffuse. And this is kind of the great response of the Palestinian solidarity protest, because it's not just saying, I am personally responsible for all this. It's we want to divest. We want to pull out of these things. And it is that awareness which does motivate it, absolutely. But in terms of just realizing how much blood is in everything. There's a brilliant song to me that explains the Marxist theory of the value form by Daniel Kahn. It's a klezmer artist. It's called The Butcher's Share. It's the person you don't want to think about. It's the person who's got to kill the animal, the person who has to set sort of the acceptable levels of death. I mean, I can say this, I'm not from this country. Cuomo! Fucking hell. Like, the amount of people condemned to death by that murderous cunt. Sorry, that was the Australian sense, not the American sense of the term. The amount of blood that just goes into the everyday running of things, if we sort of get a sense of that, we would be horrified by it, but this is the aspect of finding each other. It's finding each other in those moments of horror and then thinking collectively we can basically gunk up the system. The system requires us to constantly be moving, buying. Every time you go through like any sort of checkpoint, you're making data, for example. Every time you're scrolling, production and consumption are fusing more and more. And as we see from these encampments, we see from occupations, the main threat is standing still. Even like thinking about in China, the Tang Pingist movement lie flat. They get terrified if you stand still because it requires this constant motion. And if you there is an element of you have to refuse to move with it. And it's hard, especially in the bit, you can't do it on your own. You need pools of resources, you need stuff like strike funds. It's the same thing with reading any of these incredibly fucking difficult French theory books or German theory books. The podcast isn't just us explaining them to you, it's us explaining, we learn in the middle of these things. Because if you can't read these books on your own, good for you. I can't. You can never read these books. Most people can't read these books by themselves. People are like, how do you read all these books? I don't. We read them. Like I read like Bataille, like Zeta. We read Bataille together. No, we Bataille. It's in his the Bataille isn't in my bank. It's in his house. You know, fucking. It's like Jimmy Stewart here. Like it is a collective project. You can't do this shit on your own. And this one of the main sort of quotes from a British trade unionist called Bob Crow, R.I.P., that inspired this book is, if you spit on your own, you're not going to get anything. But if we all spit together, we can drown the bastards.
All power to the podcast. Let's. We're at about an hour. Maybe we'll take like 2 or 3 more questions. Anything you've heard in an episode? You want to know personal details?
We have someone here.
All right, let's do it.
I don't want to give front privilege too much privilege, but
Is there anyone in the back we might miss? Okay, there you go.
I had a question about images. Like Bachelard in the Poetics of Space speaks of images as not participating in a causal order. And he also carves out a space for the autonomy of images that is determinate, but not determined
That's right.
per him, per a causal order. And so there's a tension, or at least there seems to me to be a tension in Bachelard, where he both says that images are autonomous, that images don't participate in a causal order, but that they do have this kind of determinative content, which he, through many images, seeks to excavate, or seeks to encounter. Excavate is probably not the right word for that. And so with the movement away from categorization or ocularity, is that movement itself what is the value, or is the value to be found in what we find ourselves capable of imagining when we see the categories that we inherit not as necessary, not as things that are determined by essences that are transcendent or somewhere permanent and changeless. Is the value in imperceptibility or in illegibility about a particular movement, or is it about what is capable of arising after that? And the connection with Bachelard, I think, is he seems to privilege and have certain images that are valuable to him. He finds things in those images while also seeking to maintain a causal independence of them. And it seems like a tension, a generative one. But I'm wondering what's valuable in the movement of illegibility.
Yeah, so thank you. That's a great question. So I talk about Bachelard a little bit in the chapter on the imageless image. I think I even coined a term which I called the speculative autogeny of the imagination, which is just a highfalutin term, which means that whatever the imagination is, the kind of font that we understand the imagination to be, is that it is a determining factor, but it cannot be determined or perhaps even completely over-determined by anything. And here's the challenge. Is there an external world to the imagination which determines it? I believe in the Deleuzean sense, yes, that there is a sort of violence which propagates this flow, this font of the imagination. But is it reducible to value? That's where we have the problem, I believe. Because when we're talking about value, we're talking about grids of intelligibility. And so the way that I think Bachelard and James Hillman in particular are useful is they subvert what on the face is a tendency in the work of Carl Jung and Freud and even Lacan to brook this sort of deal with science. Scientificity, is that the word? In that there is a fundamental ability to know what an image is that does not derive itself from the imagination. I believe that's just a false claim. I return to the notion of the imagination almost in a way that cuts across the grain of my Deleuzian commitments. But I do know in the book that Deleuze, in some essays, is ambivalent, as any good philosopher should be. I think we should have these essays where we're kind of coming down on the side of the things that we're not so sure about, and then maybe taking a more extreme stance to sort of like test the waters. And I think this is one of the things that I do in the book. I adopt a very extreme voice to suggest that the imagination, qua imagination, is something that is not. And if we imagine it that way, then it has subversive capacities. That's what I'd like to believe anyway. And of course, it suffers from the problem of infinite regress, right? So this is one of the philosophical challenges to it. But we then need to make an account, I believe, of how the imagination is motivated by these external factors. And this is where I think the question of becoming comes in, and where the notion of metaphor that we find in Carl Jung and even James Hillman, I think, suffers somewhat. I think Bachelard is, in that sense, a very important figure that I think has a sort of revolutionary kernel within him. I mean, he was certainly inspirational to a lot of the figures that we deal with. And with that said, I think it is the notion of poiesis and imagination as the font of the poetic act, which makes us able to create the new. And to be honest, I've looked at all of the seminars that Deleuze and Guattari did on their idea of the crystal image. I don't know if anybody has looked at that stuff. It's essentially a negotiation, I think, between some Guattari stuff that Deleuze was interested in, and Bergson is in there a little bit. And I honestly don't see a very stark difference that they make from somebody like James Hillman or Bachelard in that sense. I think there's a lot of sort of, semantic wrangling that they do in order to overcome the theater of representation. And that's why I thought it was an interesting choice, at least in the case of this book, to attempt to return to imagination, qua imagination, as a way to think through a sort of positive politics. I don't know, does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, I think so.
Cool. Should we do one more? It's getting warm in here, huh?
Yeah.
We'll do one more question, comment.
Anyone in the back?
Somebody in the back. We'll just do the back because then it makes it look like we did the back. Yeah, there's one way in the back. Perfect.
We've got two, let's do two. We get this place in about half an hour.
Okay. Yeah.
Does happy hour keep going for half an hour?
Oh no, happy hour finished at 7. That was I kept note of that. That's it.
We also use Noah as someone to kind of intimidate people with. Like I've listed him as our administrator. I probably shouldn't admit this, but yeah, he's our administrator, and I CC him on things to make it seem like we're more organizationally sound than we are. I was like, I'll CC the administrator of the show.
I haven't read the book, so apologies if this is addressed. Sure. But with the imageless image and the idea of the mystic as part of the philosophy of escape, that goes back as a way to counter fascism from Bataille. That's the origin in the ACFL. How do we, with the rise of things like Stephen Bannon and esoteric fascism, and even going to Ebola, and how that's constantly being resurged nowadays, how do we create a mystically informed leftist movement against it that does not just simply be recuperated by a right mysticism that has spent centuries already building up mystical defenses in a space that I think leftism has lacked in response?
That's an amazing question. I'm just going to say a little bit, and then I'm just going to throw it to Adam to see what he's got on it. My quick answer to that is that folks on the right, they're not giving up hierarchy. They're just not. And I think their commitment to hierarchy presupposes the kinds of grids of intelligibility, which I think a true mysticism is raging against. Here, I turn once again to Federico Campagna and the notion of the ineffable, and that even within any given grid of intelligibility, there's porousness, there's perforation, there's lines of flight. There are ways to subvert that hierarchy. And I think once we do that, we're back into the language of rhizomatics and Deleuze and Guattari. I think anyone who has not looked at Josh Ramey's book, The Hermetic Deleuze, absolutely should. I think it's really a masterpiece of secondary literature. I don't know if those words have been uttered together, a masterpiece of secondary literature, but it's great. Adam, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think my esotericism is much more in terms of, so the usefulness of esotericism is all about finding a space for silence, even going back to Bataille and inner experience. And the thing is of esoteric fascists is they're very exoteric, in which they never shut the fuck up. And they don't have a space for silence. I mean, these people they seed communication in a very literal sense, like a virus. And I think finding spaces of active imagination is very useful. I mean, I like the tarot deck mostly because it fulfills... a tarot deck is a mini gallery. Like every card deck, it's a mini gallery in your pocket, and it fulfills the function of, with a certain ironic distance, of course, it's not going to predict the future, but it will give you a sense of which, it's like an intuition pump. So, for example, there's this old trick of, you have two options, you flip a coin, and if you're disappointed by the result, you go over the other one, because now you've known what you really wanted the whole time. They are pumps to generate intuitions, or at least your feelings about desire. I don't mean intuitions in the analytic philosophical sense, in which you just intuit it and then magically it's correct, and you stick with it, whatever. That's just wish fulfillment. I think mysticism gives us sort of tools of active imagination to interrogate these things. I don't think it's necessarily averse to materialism in the proper Marxist sense, which is social relations, analyzing things in terms of social relations. Materialism is not about sort of hard stuff, matter. That is an abstraction. This has kind of been the German idealist theory of abstraction that's always been taken up. Going back to Bataille, I mean, Bataille is always a great figure. Think about the limits of the rational, whilst presupposing rationality as a totality which pervades our lives. Finding it really takes on board a point from Hegel. And this is one of the few points from Hegel I think we should take on, which is to approach a limit in philosophy is to already be, in some sense, on the other side of it, because to understand the limit, you understand what's being limited against, and therefore you're already part of the way there. And sometimes that can be only expressed in a non-philosophical sort of mode of silence or an encounter. And in the sense, we can't simply put it down to the categories, the universals we speak of in language. This is the unity, in a way, between... and please, none of you shout at me, between Deleuze and Adorno. This non-identity thinking exceeds the universal because we're all particulars. It's like the Monty Python thing. Yes, we're all individuals, but guess what? I'm not. And it's because the concept of particularity is universal, and none of us are universals, therefore we are particularly particular. This is what you see in concepts going from the work of Paul B. Preciado in the theory of the monstrosity, which means to exceed a category, all the way to inner experience in Bataille as that which is after the completion of rationality. And Bataille is a very interesting figure because he accepts Kojève's reading of Hegel, which in summary is Hegel completed philosophy, and what the fuck do we do now? He says this in a letter to Kojève saying, what do we do now? I'm just sort of left about, we've already done this all. And he's thinking about non-knowledge, this excess here. And so I think mysticism, politically informed, would have to be politically informed partially to the limits of philosophy, or in terms of limits of any mapping. And I see you should mic this up.
If I can provoke Will a little bit about this.
He provokes everyone else on Twitter.
The idea of mysticism is very pertinent, I think, in terms of community building. When there's groups in the Lower East Side right now doing Bataillean sadism, and there's a babbling brook of online techno jargon, right? And groups that are trying to do mythical community building. It's places like Sovereign House and Red Scare podcast places, not to name them. But I was introduced to those groups, introduced to those kind of groups, and Will and I have discussed a lot about that, and I think silence plays an interesting role because they will not stop talking at those parties. But yeah, something that you made me think of you, and that's right. That's great.
Silence is the key, but what's been missed in this discussion about mysticism is a liturgy. If there is such a thing as right-wing mysticism, it is that it is predicated on an institution of liturgy. And what the bad mystic does is uses mysticism to ground a more fundamental power that can be then harnessed and deployed. And this is the danger of Asafel, right? Asafel gets its iconography from the cosmic circle of Ludwig Klages, Stefan Gorga, momentarily Rilke. This idea that mysticism cleanly can be severed between sort of imposing a sort of Gauchism or like right-wing mysticism. The question of mysticism is the question of silence, of deploying silence. So I want to talk about the content of Marguerite Porret's Mirror of Simple Souls. This is a discourse between reason and love, where reason will not stop speaking and demanding that everything in this experience of the destruction of the soul be categorized and institutionalized in order for reason to be able to comprehend and reproduce it. Because reason is terrified that this essentially annihilated soul will no longer it's not a question of possessing reason or any of these sorts of rational things, but instead it's a question of whether the institution remains. So mysticism has always been, from whether it's those who left the Begin, like Porret, who says, "Oh, my sisters of the Begin, what will you think of me now?" Or, Hedevig or Hildegard. These are all thinkers who utilized mystic experience as a means of subverting the institution of control they were up against. Now, for a thinker like Hildegard, of course, we use these images given to us by God to prepare an army and a fortress for the coming of the Antichrist. But for Porret, she tells you, she warns you from the beginning, if you are a man of the cloth, I have nothing to say to you. None of this will make sense to you. Because everything with which you've come to this book looking for will not be found. None of this will be intelligible to you. I love you nonetheless, but there's nothing for you to do here. And it was a question of destituting the church, of saying that one can in fact have religious experience that is not simply gnosis or liturgy. It's a question of the politics of liturgy. What is the arrival of the Führer, if not a remarkable liturgical act on the part of the demos? What is the arrival and direction of the general will in Rousseau, if not a liturgy of alignment with this identifiable, metaphysical, unexaminable force of the will? So it is a question of refusing the necessity of liturgy. That I don't know what left wing would mean in mysticism, but of egress. The mystic is always is always in a position of egress, whether it's Meister Eckhart, Porret, or it doesn't matter. It's where they go from that point of egress. And for Eckhart, it's to deny the busyness, to let beings be. Heidegger takes this up right at the end of his life. And for Porret, it is that silence that she practiced. I mean, up until her death. And she remains, I think, ultimately uninterpretable. I would love to run a reading group on the Mirror of Simple Souls, but it is so hard as a text, precisely because I'm looking for the catechism in here, and I'm not supposed to be doing that. So when reason screams for the love of God, when the church screams for the love of God, what are you doing? And she goes, well, I'm just loving God. So it's short-circuiting or surpassing the institution that mediates your life and its form, right? That's what the institution, whether it be the apparatus, whether it be metaphysical, physical, it doesn't matter. It separates existence from its mode in order to direct it towards the correct mode. So if there is a left-wing mysticism, it is to take on oneself as a form of life that does not necessitate these bifurcations that go as far back as, you know, the identification of the human being as a political animal, and who isn't a political animal? A slave. Why? Because they don't have phronesis. So this idea of bifurcating life and the way in which life is lived, or the evocation of life as a force that is distinct from its form. This is the kernel of all reaction. This is the kernel of the demystification that the reactionary romantics sought. But I do think that thinkers like Benjamin, right, who are seeking for a romantic strain of thought that is not reactive, this has been a project that has been abandoned since his death. Arendt and Adorno both equally abandoned it. So I think in this sense, this question of what is a mysticism today is not a how do we remystify the world? No. How do we become mystics? The question of mystifying the world, that's a metaphysics. And if you want to do that, that's fine. But the mystic has always sort of stepped back. You know, and it's why thinkers who consider themselves like fundamental ontologists, like Heidegger, Sherman, in the end always end kind of unclear about what to do with the mystic, you know, sort of terrified by it. So I think for that reason, the question comes down to legitimating some sort of deeper force and then the liturgy that allows that force to come through. And that's the difference. That's what Bannon is doing, right? Mobilizing the virility of the forgotten white man, right? And producing a liturgy of whiteness that can then become an institution and a political force. Now, so far Bannon has hilariously failed in this, but in other ways he has not. In a certain sense, these groups like the Proud Boys, they're remarkably liturgical. So it's this opposition to a liturgy and an opposition to the enforcement of a higher, deeper power that I think has to be resisted. And that's where one finds like a leftist or a liberationist mystic. I really don't know there's no word sufficient enough to capture what I think you're getting at, but it's really important, right? Because the bad mystic uses mysticism to destroy mysticism.
I mean, one of the things that comes up for me is ecstasy without sacrifice, I think entails a kind of risk. Hermeticism without dissipation, laughter without silence. And just thinking about silence for a moment, a community of silence, I mean, in the manner that Asafel and Bataille envisioned, even, you know, talking with you a bit earlier about Buddhism, the Sangha as a community that sits in silence together. I mean, of course, there's right-wing implications for institutional Buddhism, but I think, you know, it's interesting to think about the problem and observe the problem from the perspective of what are certain groups' political commitments, what are they eliding from this quote-unquote mystical practice, what is it that they seem afraid of, and I don't know, it seems at least in the year 2024, the notion of desubjectivation, at least understood in the terms with which we spell it out in Anti-Oculus, I think is firmly a left-wing issue. And I think there certainly is a place for that, you know, within developing communities of silence, quote unquote, sacred conspiracies. And just going back once again to Federico Campagna, who I have in the mind, you want to experience mysticism? Okay, go break up a migrant raid. Get some people together, right? You want to see what another form of life is like? Do you want to have the ecstasy of, you know, overcoming the breach between you and I who is different? It's to find each other in that vulnerability and unsettle those institutions, unsettle those practices that create that rift. There's a real political thing you can do.
I mean, all I'll say, because it's bloody hot in it. But all I will say finally is that one of the most beautiful things in terms of thinking about these concepts of vacuoles of non-communication and the practical mysticism is in the media discipline of these encampments. They are not asking for, which is essentially the main electoralist route of, essentially if you're an electoralist, you are asking for the consent of the press for you to exist in this sort of arena of options in a marketplace of ideas. No such thing, of course. The refusal to speak to these agitators, these peddlers of stochastic terrorism we call the press, is to affirm that, much like Marguerite Porete before the Inquisitor, my ideas, what I am, my way of my life does not persist by the consent of the liturgy of the church, and these encampments do not exist by the legitimation or the consent of the press. And they never will, hence why they give them what they deserve, which is silence, or something which they can't simply use. And I think refusing, or not refusing mediation, but mediating that mediation with silence is a real part of a... If you look at practical mysticism, stop an immigration ban. They don't have to ask you why. They can't move. The proletariat doesn't need to speak. Your ports are blocked. But you can't do that. It reminds me a little bit of this apocryphal story from the collapse of the Holy Roman Empire towards its final days. The Austrian emperor, his chancellor Metternich, comes up to him and says, "My emperor, I'm sorry, the people are storming the palace." And the emperor says, "Well, they're not allowed to do that, are they?"
Thank you very much for coming here tonight. We have books if you want to buy one, and thank you for listening to Acid Horizon.
Thank you all for coming.